I don't think I'll sleep until they catch this guy.
The person who murdered Lynn Bartholomew's daughter, Melissa, and continues to haunt her youngest child.
I'm scared of my own protection. The fact that he was calling my phone, I have to be worried about, is that going to happen to me one day?
They had been taunted by this guy. And that had come out in the course of reporting out this story, that he had called their families, taunted them, and talked about what he had done to their loved one.
Over the next 5 weeks or so, he would call the then 15-year-old 5 more times, eerily each time from Melissa's cell, at one point saying he had killed Melissa.
They were very taunting and angry words. My heart would stop and just didn't even know what to do mostly.
He had a system. He had a clear system. Burner phones. He stalked people on social media. He stalked the families on social media.
The Suffolk DA describing to the judge how Heuermann used 7 different burner phones. He would take selfies on them like these and use them to search for victims and violent pornography. He even searched obsessively for the relatives of his victims.
And he was doing it from Midtown Manhattan. There was sounds of traffic in the background, and we'd been hearing all of this. And the families and their representatives had been telling us this for years. And the police had not. The police had been very careful not to reveal this information to us publicly throughout various iterations of the leadership in the police department.
When we talked about, not going before the media, if you see, Rodney did go before the media, but it was always in a very controlled manner, and it was always with a controlled purpose. Again, we did that because we knew we were playing before an audience of one person.
I'd want to know actually what he was doing during that time. And we know he was going to work, he had a family.
We know that he is 59 years old, lived in Massapequa Park, and worked in Manhattan. He was married and had 2 children.
He was functioning in New York City as a building engineer.
Rex Heuermann, I'm an architect, I'm an architectural consultant, I'm a troubleshooter, born and raised on Long Island.
Okay.
Been working in Manhattan since 1987.
But with respect to the 4 women that we'd covered that have been attributed to him, I mean, how aware was he of every step of the search, and how was he consuming that information?
Searching on the internet at one point, why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been found?
He was Googling about himself.
In a 14-month period, he had over 200 searches pertaining to the Gilgo investigation.
Even through this, I never became like an expert on the psychology of a serial killer. I mean, there are people who focus on this. But what little I know is that they are, incessantly narcissistic, right? They want credit for what they've done. They want people to know about what they've done.
He was compulsively searching pictures of the victims, but not only pictures of the victims, pictures of their relatives, their sisters, their children, and he was trying to locate those individuals.
He asked me if I knew about the Gilgo Beach murders. And back then, I was like, oh, he's just from that area. But now I just see it as a serial killer, kind of just putting it in somebody's face.
There's some kind of thrill of the hunt, of being the hunted and staying a step ahead of investigators.
We knew that this one person would be watching, and we didn't want to give him any insight into what we were doing. And we also didn't want him to know just how close we were getting.
It was such a close call that I almost don't even know if I can carry on in my industry.
Following Rex Heuermann's arrest, I ended up speaking with a woman who was a sex worker in this area around that time.
Once I had the name, I ran him through the screening tools that we have to keep us safe. One of the phone numbers was saved as do not answer. If I get a vibe from somebody that this person is scary or that they might try and contact me from like another number, that's when I'll save them as do not answer. So it's really scary to find out that the person was actually only less than a mile from me.
Were you working on Long Island during the time of these disappearances?
Yes, I was. And I was avoiding... Sorry.
Take your time.
I was avoiding calls to the Hamptons because I thought that's where the person was. And so I started working in the city. And then to find out that the person is actually working in the city and living right next to me is just really scary.
There were several sex workers that spoke out after his arrest. It was chilling to hear what they had to say.
I had a really, really bad feeling. Like my gut was like telling me I needed to get away from him.
Former escort Nikki Brass, who says Heuermann solicited her approximately 8 years ago. He actually mentioned the Gilgo case.
When he talked about it, he would like speak in a they and hypothetical. but he had this like smile on his face that made me really uneasy.
It sent shivers up the back of my neck as we're listening to what she's describing, and you think of what could have happened and what she managed to avoid.
One thing I struggle with as an investigative reporter is that we know that this tip about the Chevy Avalanche belonging to this gentleman who was last seen with Amber Costello, that tip came in 2010.
He was driving a dark-colored, black, first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche with a unique feature that was between it's a pickup truck, so it was between the cab and the bed, and that was identified. Again, that was back in 2010.
For law enforcement to not take that tip seriously until 12 years later is something that is highly questionable.
It wasn't until March of 2022 that that database was searched by the task force and this individual was identified.
That tip was called in by Amber Costello's roommate and friend because he knew that Amber had disappeared.
She wouldn't just leave with anybody, you know, she wasn't stupid, you know, and even though it was money like that, you know, it kind of makes me believe that she was comfortable enough with this person.
Amber Costello, the day before her disappearance on September 1st, 2010, she met with an individual for the purposes of having him pay her money for her services, but she involved herself in a ruse where once the individual gave her money, other individuals came into the house, pretended to be his significant others, confronted the individual with the purpose of making that individual uncomfortable, having him leave without retrieving his money, and that's exactly what happened.
He knew that Amber had probably been harmed, and he knew the last person who was with her, this gentleman that had come into the house.
She wound up leaving with, you know, that night.
That individual was identified as a person who was between 6'4" and 6'6", a large man, thickly built, and dark hair.
So why, 12 years later, is this the first time that police are really looking at that tip? Police have not been able to provide a good answer to that question.
Honestly, what has Rex Heuermann been doing all this time? He's only a suspect, he hasn't been convicted, but if in fact he did this, why would he have stopped in 2010? And so for all the time that went by, and you know, they caught him on a tip that they got way back when, the thing about the truck. So what I want to know is has he theoretically killed anybody else? And could that have been prevented if they ran this case more professionally from the start?
We still don't know where these women were murdered. Their bodies were found at Gilgo, but that doesn't mean that's where they were killed. And so that is something that is still part of this investigation.
Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney visits the site, answering the burning question if he thinks anyone might have been killed in Heuermann's house.
Evidence does not point either one way or the other.
Could Rex Heuermann be linked to some of these other victims? Absolutely. That's what investigators are going to have to figure out.
Bodies, the demographics were a little different, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to take a closer look and see if Rex Heuermann is attached to them or other bodies that might have been discovered throughout the state.
Do the killings of the other victims resemble the Gilgo 4? They do not. They are not just looking at Rex Heuermann for these other killings.
We'll continue to go after those that committed these crimes and hold them accountable.
This is an extended period of time for these homicides to happen. That means there's that many more potential suspects because the amount of time that has gone by.
The case now expanding across the country, with investigators searching Heuermann's property in Las Vegas and in South Carolina, where they retrieved this pickup truck believed to be connected to the killing.
Suffolk County Police and the Gilgo Beach Task Force and the FBI will tell you they are investigating, working with all the police departments.
The investigators were never discouraged. They continued and uncovered evidence and followed leads. They never stopped working and will continue to work tirelessly until we bring justice to all the families involved.
We know so much about the Gilgo 4, and we know so little about everybody else. Those people were murdered. And those killers need to be found too.
I can't imagine what it must feel like so many years later to hear that there's finally an arrest in this case. I also can't imagine what it feels like to be a family member of one of the other victims. There's all this hoopla around this arrest, but there are 6 other victims whose cases have never been solved and may never be solved.